Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ari Chukral, JINSA's Assistant Director of Foreign Policy. Today, we will be discussing Iranian maritime aggression and the possible deployment of U.S. Marines aboard commercial ships in the Arabian Gulf. For this discussion, I'm happy to be joined by two experts who have extensive experience dealing with these issues. Retired Vice Admiral Mark Fox is the former Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command. He served as Commander of U.S. Naval Central Command, U.S. Fifth Fleet Combined Maritime Forces, commanded Carrier Strike Group 10 aboard USS Harry S. Truman, and commanded the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center. Admiral Fox is a JINSA Abraham Accords Policy Project and Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project member. He was a participant on JINSA's 2018 Generals and Admirals trip to Israel. Joining us also is retired Lieutenant General Dave Beidler. He is the former commander of Marine Forces Central Command. He commanded the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force and Marine Corps Forces Africa in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and commanded the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing in Okinawa, Japan. General Beidler was a participant on JINSA's 2023 Generals and Admirals trip to Israel. The United States and its Middle Eastern partners have struggled to deter Iran's escalation of maritime aggression against oil tankers in the Arabian Gulf waterways, vital to international shipping. Amid other recent U.S. deployments to the Middle East, in response to this growing challenge, the Pentagon is reportedly considering the deployment of U.S. Marines on commercial vessels to better protect against Iranian attempts to illegally seize them and attack them. As a shameless plug before we get started, my JINSA colleagues, Joni Tobin and Zach Shokraut, and I published a memo yesterday with analysis on this topic that you can find on the JINSA website. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please submit them through Zoom. Admiral Fox, I'll start with you. What types of Iranian harassment and threats did you observe when serving in CENTCOM, and how do they differ from what we have seen recently?
Well, the Iranians are the world's best at keeping things just below the boiling point. And they are the authors of all kinds of malevolent activity. Basically, they use small boats, they fly drones, they fly airplanes to come out and harass. They have actually boarded and seized some vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. They've put limpet mines on vessels. I think it was back in the 2018 timeframe. So they are a state sponsor of malevolent activity in the region, and it's one of those cases where you're always fraught with the potential for miscalculation in those situations because, and in fact, you can go back and I always pointed out when I was in command at Fifth Fleet at one of the worst miscalculations was the downing of an Iranian Airbus back in 1988 in the midst of one of these little tete-a-tetes that was going on. So it's a region that's fraught with potential miscalculation, and it requires a lot of discipline on the part of all of the coalition members to have satisfactory outcomes, when we interact with them. But we, the Navy, interact with the Iranians every day.
Thank you, and maybe later we can circle back around to some other precedents for what's going on in the region. General Beidler, I'll ask you the same question.
All right, thank you. First off, thanks for having me this afternoon. It's always good to be back with Admiral Fox. We spent a lot of time together at U.S. Central Command, both in Tampa and in the region. Just a couple points up front from me. First, I want to make sure that everybody realizes my comments here this afternoon are my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, the Defense Department, or the United States Marine Corps. And second, this is an exceptionally complex issue. And we're going to discuss a range of things as this goes forward, and we'll probably go well beyond just the military domain. We'll probably talk about legal and diplomatic and political issues associated with this potential move. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows I'm not a diplomat, a lawyer, or a politician in that regard. But going back to your first question, I'm certainly aware of Iranian harassment at sea. And in my last posting associated with U.S. Central Command as the MARCENT commander, to be quite honest with you, I was more focused on Marines as they fought alongside the Army in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. Now, that does not mean that there weren't Marines at sea embarked on naval vessels, but my experience with the Iranians at sea is a little bit different than that of Admiral Fox's. I would say that I did make a cruise on the USS America back in the day, and we were very concerned in the Arabian Gulf of what we used to call and still call, I believe, malign and nefarious activity by the Iranians. They're always up to something, and it tends not to be good. It tends not to be good in relation to American interest and the interest of our partners and allies in the region. And Admiral Fox mentioned a number of those things that occur at sea, but they also occur, and they have occurred on land. They have sponsored a lot of units, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others, Shia units that have worked actively against our forces on the land. And I think that we're all aware of that. But the Iranians are good at making things difficult, if not deadly, in the region. And in talking to some of our Gulf partners, they used to say that the Iranians like to create trouble. They like to make it difficult for people. They like to see people suffer is kind of the words that they would use, that they can always make things worse than they currently are. So we've discussed what they generally do at sea, but they do it across the region, on the sea, on the land, and in the air.
Thank you, General Beidler. The Pentagon's reportedly considering deploying Marines aboard commercial vessels. Before digging into this specific mission, what's a Marine Expeditionary Unit it's been raised as what's potentially being deployed, or a fast unit, and what unique capabilities do they bring?
Great. Let me explain to you what the Marines at sea embarked on Navy vessels do. The Marine Expeditionary Unit is the smallest of our Marine Air Ground task forces that are formed and deploy on naval shipping to go out on deployments of about 6 to 9 months to do things around the globe from the sea that are required. The MU is made up of 4 elements. It is framed around an infantry battalion of about 1,000 to 1,100 Marines, with all of the equipment that comes with 1,000 ground Marines. In addition to that, it has an aviation combat element, something that I'm more familiar with as an aviator, having provided those forces to MUs in the past. And that element is about 600 Marines or so, with a number of aircraft that give that embarked Marine element lots of capability and a lot of range. About 10 to 12 MV-22s, tilt rotor, that can carry 18 to 20 Marines and go 700 miles or so. 6 AV-8 Harriers, tactical attack jets, being replaced by F-35Bs with a vertical or a short takeoff and vertical landing capability. Heavy lift helicopters for resupply, attack helicopters, and 2 Navy helicopters for utility. Again, I would say, and I'm a bit parochial, but the aviation combat element gives the MU tremendous reach throughout the region and allows it to do a lot of its assigned missions, raids, non-combatant evacuation operations, security operations, tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel, direct action, humanitarian assistance, all of those kinds of things that the American people expect Marines to be able to do in crisis response. The third element is very, very important, and that's logistics. And that will play a key piece in whatever is done with Marines being perhaps placed on commercial vessels. Logistically sustaining them at sea on those vessels will be very important. And that element is, again, several hundred people that allow the MEU embark to sustain itself. Finally, there is a Marine Special Purpose Force, a small group, highly trained, not special operations forces, but highly trained forces that can do those unique and riskier missions in that mission set. I think that those will be the Marines that will be the go-to force initially, just based on their experience and training regimen before they deploy and the special equipment and skills that they bring. And then finally, a command element. And a big part of this is going to be command and control. Command and control of these forces distributed across many ships, commercial ships, in a unique environment. So it's a self-contained force. And to be quite honest with you, it kind of looks like the joint forces that will be in support of this and other Navy forces.
As General Byler, as a follow-up to that, is deploying Marines aboard commercial ships something that Central Command would have drilled? And what would that look like in practice? You mentioned the command element and what the units look like, but what does that look like in practice? When would they disembark? And I guess building on a question we've already received, how likely do you think is it that President Biden will follow through on issuing such an order, or is just deterring, or is just saying that it's possible Marines will be on ships enough to deter Iran?
Well, merely saying it will lend itself to deterrence, I believe. It's not unlike the Air Marshal program, if you will. If you don't know where the Marines are, you may be reluctant to do anything in the region where you may encounter Marines. And I'm a bit parochial on this, but when you say Marines, there is a threat that comes with that. I think when we say that we're going to embark Marines, we mean business. And I think people take that to heart around the region and around the globe. So this is not a mission that is unheard of. It's not a mission we haven't thought about before. It's not a mission that we've done before, that we've not done before. And new Marines are trained for shipboard ops. Their workup program is 6 to 9 months at sea periods, and operating as a soldiers of the sea, naval infantry from ships comes with risk. Risk getting on and off ships, and all that comes with operating in a very hazardous environment at sea. Some might say ships are ships, and there's not a lot of difference in moving from a gray Navy warship to a commercial ship. I would beg to differ. There's a lot of difference between those two structures. So these commercial ships are fundamentally different. Not that skills don't transfer, but the bottom line is they're not warships. They're not protected. They're not equipped, like a warship would be. They don't have stations or platforms for crew-served weapons like our U.S. Navy platforms. They don't have the comms, the communication systems, or command and control nodes that would come with a Navy ship, resupply, intelligence, medical, the list goes on. So there are going to be some things that are going to be a bit unique to this environment in which Marines would be placed. And I think that they'll have to rely on the Navy and rely on Navy ships in the region for a number of things while on these commercial ships and vessels. This is going to be a little bit different because the MEU's typically trained to conduct operations from a ship, not on a ship. They typically are moved to a point of friction, and then they leave the ship to do and conduct whatever mission they're assigned away from the ship. Now, certainly they lend themselves to the defense of Navy shipping, and they do that when they're not assigned missions away from the ship, but this will be a little bit different. But it's not something that the Marines are not capable of with a little additional training, and it sounds like that training is ongoing.
Admiral Fox, how is the United States and its partners sought to deter and protect against Iranian aggression so far? What kinds of multinational coalitions already exist in the region, and how have those been successful or unsuccessful?
Well, one of the good news things about this problem set that we've dealt with the Iranians is it's created a willingness and an opportunity for cooperation amongst a large international community. And so Fifth Fleet is a Navy US fleet. NAVCENT is the naval component for Central Command, and then there's the Combined Maritime Force. And the Combined Maritime Force, over 30 nations are members of this. And the way it's organized, there are different task forces that are created with specific missions in mind that will allow nations to choose which task force they want their forces to be part of. In other words, there's one, CTF 151 is a counter-piracy task force. CTF 152 is focused on the Persian Gulf security. And every single day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, at least 17 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz, sometimes up to 20 or 21 million barrels. So there's a really heavy flow, probably 85%, maybe 90% of Asia, of that oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia. And so you have a very wide spectrum of people who are very interested in the security of the energy supplies that are flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. So these CTFs, it depends, the command of the CTF will rotate. So you'll have a Bahraini commodore or a commander, and then you'll have somebody from New Zealand or Australia. It's a remarkable thing to see how this international cooperation takes place in these different CTFs. But it's also there's a huge number of ships out there. And one of the challenges is, how do you get the security forces, the Marines in this case, on the right ship at the right time? There are a lot of really difficult, Smoke alluded to this. This is a really, really challenging logistics problem, just because there are a lot more ships than we have security teams to go aboard. And the other piece of this, so there's a policy piece that I'm not witting to, and it's hard for me to kind of opine from where I sit now anymore. Back in the 1980s, Kuwait asked us, they asked the Soviets as well, to reflag their ships to help them, because the Iranians were attacking Kuwaiti ships and the oil terminals during the Iran-Iraq War. And there was a specific ask of Kuwait to the United States and to the Soviet Union. I think it was a way that the Kuwaitis prodded us into action, just to make sure that we didn't let the Soviets get in there. I don't know if there are any asks that are going on, or if this is something that we've now decided that we want to do. And so there are several pieces of this that I can't give you a good answer, other than that this is a really complicated problem in terms of getting Marines on ships at the right time, at the right place, and then they go in. And the way the oil companies operate, Fujairah is a large port. It's an Emirati port on the outside of the Strait of Hormuz. It's on the Arabian Gulf, the Arabian Sea side. And the way that oil companies operate, they have a minimum amount of time for their tankers to spend in the Gulf. So if you ever fly over Fujairah, you look down and there's probably 100 tankers waiting. And then, depending on what their load is, they'll sortie an empty tanker into the Gulf, spend the minimum amount of time there, and then get it out of there. So that's the model. You'll see just a huge number of ships in Fujairah, which is outside the Gulf, and then only the ones that are actually going or laden and coming back out are the ones that are actually inside the Gulf.
As a follow-up, we have a question in from Randy and Charles Wax, senior fellow John Hanna. Ideally, wouldn't the effort to protect commercial shipping have a greater multinational character to it? Specifically, don't U.S. regional partners who have the most at stake have groups of special forces that could be deployed in small numbers to ships with U.S. naval, air, and logistics capabilities playing more of a support role?
Well, the answer is yes. We had a pirated ship when I was commander of Fifth Fleet that the Emirati Presidential Guards, the UAE Presidential Guards, actually, we flew them out to the carrier and then we heloed them out to USS Kidd, and so that they could seize back a pirated ship that was an Emirati owned and Emirati flagged vessel. So yeah, there's opportunity here for international coalition cooperation in this. We, the US, are certainly the framework that will create the command and control and the movement. Not many people have got the assets that we do in terms of how you set this thing up. But yeah, there's tremendous opportunity, I think, for international cooperation here.
Along the similar lines of international cooperation, CENTCOM has pushed and made important progress on developing integrated air and missile defense throughout the Middle East. What kind of integrated sensors and systems has CENTCOM been able to develop, either through the multinational task forces or through its own initiative in the naval space?
Well, you know, Admiral Cooper, who's the current Fifth Fleet commander now, has made a tremendous, has had a tremendous focus on using remotely operated or unmanned vehicles to increase his battle space awareness. Now, he's made a virtue of the fact that he doesn't have the normal carrier strike group resources that I had when I was in command, but he's moving in the right direction in terms of creating a recognized domain awareness of what's going on. You have to kind of, the ocean, even though there are thousands of ships, it's still a big ocean, and it's really hard to, you need to be able to cue your sensors and cue your activities in a way that takes advantage of the geography that you're able to exploit, if you will. So you always put yourself in a place, but you have a finite number of forces, and knowing what, you know, kind of skating to the puck. If you're able to anticipate and understand what the environment is like, you can be a lot more effective with relatively small numbers of resources of ships.
We have a question in from General Bednarik. He asks, with the current NDS prioritizing the Indo-PACOM AOR against the pacing challenge of China, how do you see the resources across DoD supporting our important efforts to keep Iran in check? I'll open that up to either of you.
Well, here's my take on this. We, the US, have international commitments and international interest, global. And this business is saying, well, we're going to rebalance to one thing or another, or we're going to focus more on this. It's an insult to the people that you're taking forces away if you go, well, you're not important enough for us to focus on. I don't think that this is a personal opinion, we should never be talking about how we have decided we're going to allocate. We can walk and chew gum. We've always had forces in the Pacific. We've always had forces in the Middle East. And the great thing about naval forces is they can move. And so I think that we can handle this and we can manage the problem. There were Pacific assets that would come to the Gulf when they were needed. There are times where the one thing that's very different is the Pacific Fleet has assigned forces. The Fifth Fleet does not. And so the Fifth Fleet always, with the exception of minesweepers and some patrol craft, the Fifth Fleet uses a rotational construct either from the East or the West Coast. So they don't have assigned forces the way that, in particular, 7th Fleet and the Pacific AOR do. So, and that's one of the reasons that, truth be told, we've always known that the Pacific is important. We've always had forces there, and they have assigned forces just because of that. So I've always had a bit of a beef about, okay, we're rebalancing now to Asia Pacific, which now tells the people in Europe and the Middle East that, well, y'all aren't that important after all. And it made for some rather, conversations that you'd really have preferred not to have had with some of the, the leadership in there going, well, what are you guys doing? Anyway, we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Ari, if I could pile onto that, I would argue that Indo-PACOM is as interested in the Strait of Hormuz as U.S. Central Command. 76%, you pick the number, 75, 3/4 of the oil that comes through the Strait of Hormuz goes into the Indo-Pacific and goes to Asian consumers. Some would say that the first island chain ends right about where the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean meet. So they are keenly interested in all that's transpiring in the Arabian Gulf.
I think those are great points about the interconnectivity of challenges we face in various regions and how they extend really throughout the world. General Beidler, I'll bring it back to you. What kind of threats would Marines be best suited to address in terms of how Iran is, harassing or attacking ships? And to bring in a question we were asked, Iran has made good use of these small drones. Would Marines be helpful in countering those?
Hey, let me go back to the previous question just a bit, and I'll come back to this one. And that was, do you think that our regional partners can do more? And the simple answer is I think the question was, what more can or should they do? And the answer for me is more. I don't know why we should necessarily, and I'm going to move out of the pure military lane here, I suppose, for a second. I don't know why we should be more interested in the defense there than they are interested in their defense. And you've got to ask the question, whose oil is it and where is that oil going? And there's a lot to be considered in all of that. But certainly this initiative is continuing to bring the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps closer and closer together. Our current and recently former Chief of Naval Operations and our recently former Commandant of the Marine Corps have worked very hard to bring the two services back to see things from a naval perspective, back to the sea, back to our roots. And that is something we're working on. And I think that 5th Fleet and MARCENT are working on that with regional partners to try to get them to see this as a collective requirement, not unlike all the work that's being done in the Indo-PACOM theater with allies and partners and collectively there. But how could Marines aboard commercial vessels deter or protect against? I think that, again, as I mentioned earlier on, they can deter just from the standpoint of our announcement that we're going to do something along these lines. The problem is there are hundreds of vessels in the region, and we're talking about 100 Marines in teams of 15 to 19. At the risk of public math, that looks like we will be on 5 or 6 vessels at a time. And how we pick those will be interesting, to say the least. We might move those Marines around to different vessels at different times on that transit. And I'm sure we know where we need the Marines on those commercial vessels more than in other locations. I'm sure there's been a lot of work done on that. And this really gets to a freedom of navigation issue, and one that the U.S. Navy is the world's champion for, and that is, freedom of navigation right of innocent passage and access to the waterways that allow us to conduct commerce. The laws of the sea and all of that. But I think that there are ranges that they can do. They can certainly prevent boarding. You will not get on a commercial vessel that has a contingent of Marines on board. I think that they can protect against close passes by ships that are threatening. They do have counter drone, counter UAS capabilities. They have counter air capabilities. And because you have that contingent with their intelligence and with their comm circuits, they can bring other naval assets to bear in support of an incident relative to a commercial vessel that would not be possible quickly in the past.
So to follow up with that, what kind of capabilities could you envision Iran using that Marines would be less effective or not effective at handling?
Swarm attacks, I suppose, would be difficult to counter, be they on the surface or in the air. I think that there's a question in here. Are ships, even naval vessels, defendable in today's tactics? U.S. Navy vessels certainly are defendable. They've proven that. They've proven it recently in the Southern Red Sea. But swarm attacks are problematic for almost any defensive system, be they UAS or boat swarms that the Iranians have demonstrated some capability for.
Admiral Fox, I'll open it up to you to answer.
Yeah, let me just pile on a little bit. One of the things that we did when we were operating in Iraq and Afghanistan and now in Syria still is the ability to with the command and control construct, to be able to have tactical airplanes available or helicopters to respond to a troop in contact event. And so using that same concept, if you've got the command and control and you've got the communications set up right, you should be able to also use more than just the Marines that are on the ship, but having either helicopters from a Navy vessel or from the ARG for that matter. They've got gunships, and then we've got AV-8Bs or F-35Bs or the F-35s that are shore-based. So you need to take a broader view, in my opinion, of making sure that you're setting yourself up for success. And the key goes back to domain awareness and having really solid intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, understanding what's going on. And if you've got that, then you can be much more effective in terms of responding with the right level or with the right kind of action in a situation like that.
Admiral Fox, I'll stay with you. You raised a historical example earlier of the shoot down of the drone. I'm wondering what precedent is there for the United States to launch initiatives to better protect shipping in the Gulf, and how might they relate to the current situation?
The thing I alluded to is it was an Iranian airliner. It was an Airbus.
Right, airline.
Not a drone. There were 290 innocent people who died when the Vincennes shot them down, and it was because of a miscalculation, which is the very thing that, as a Fifth Fleet commander, always defend yourself. You can never take that shot. But at the same time, Vincennes was in the midst of a surface skirmish with small boats, and then they misinterpreted this airplane that launched out of Bandar Abbas and shot it down. And so that's the very point that I've always emphasized, is this kind of behavior creates a lot of potential for miscalculation. And you just, grown-ups should not be doing that to each other. So I'm sorry, back to the question that you asked me. Repeat it, please.
Sure. What precedent is there for the United States to launch initiatives to better protect shipping in the Gulf?
Well, I think it's applying all of the things that we've just discussed, although I still am, from an outside perspective and looking at this, it's a good thing that there's actually a discussion about putting Marines onto these ships, but the devil's in the details. You know, who has the authority? Who makes the decision to use lethal force? Is it the security, the FAST team, or is it the master of the ship? These are different nations. I mean, there's a whole lot of, I'd be asking a lot of questions as the fleet commander, just saying, okay, tell me how we're supposed to figure this one out. So all of these different initiatives, and it's really driven by awareness. If you've got situational awareness, then you know how to either send a warship or an airplane, or it's one of those things where anytime you have someone intent on making mischief in the region, like Iran, they're going to find ways to try to be in the place that you're not. They live there. They have Abu Musa. They have all of these islands. And so it's imperative for us, and you have to have innocent passage. You just can't go out there and camp out and park yourself in the Strait of Hormuz. So there are limits and there are restrictions, but at the same time, and a lot of this, I think, depends also on the Iranians' perception of our political will. And I'm getting out of my lane a little bit, but if we publicly announce whatever handcuffs or restrictions that we apply, well, we're going to do this, but not too hard or something like that, then it may look good for certain members of the global audience, but the Iranians will interpret it in a way that they'll take advantage of it. I'll put it that way.
Building on your point about the limitations, Admiral Fox, when can the United States intervene to help a ship that is being harassed or attacked by Iran or really any other nation? Does the ship need to fly a U.S. flag, or are there conditions or agreements where the U.S. Navy can assist ships flying other flags?
Well, there is the law of the sea, and you always help mariners that are in distress. At the same time, it's one of those, it depends. Even when we send our warships through, we see these kind of, the harassing kinds of small boat, swarms and drills and that sort of thing, throwing boxes out in front of you. And it requires a real disciplined, but at the same time prepared and well-trained force to be able to handle that. Anytime we, the U.S., have a ship that's in a place where they can help a commercial ship that's under attack or being harassed, we will do that. We're into freedom of navigation. But this does come back to, if you're using lethal force, that there's another step here that's different in terms of how you work the rules of engagement. There's some really lot of devil in those details.
General Beidler, and I'll remind everyone, if you have questions throughout the discussion, the rest of the discussion, please submit them through Zoom. General Beidler, what are the issues or considerations that the Pentagon and commanders in the region may have to factor when deciding on rules of engagement for the Marines who are potentially aboard commercial vessels? And are there risks to making them either too restrictive or too lenient?
Boy, the list of considerations is a mile long here. Admiral Fox just mentioned that, national interest, freedom of navigation, law at sea, right of innocent passage, rules of engagement. There's a lot to this. I think that the key to all this is we're trying to deter Iran, and we've got to make that first and foremost. And achieving deterrence is one of those mission outcomes that's tough to define at times. You know, how do you know that you're being successful in deterring and deterring big events, small events, and so forth? And all of this really begs the question of risk and what are the unintended consequences of doing this? What could go wrong? And boy, you can see a lot of things that could go wrong here. Certainly the risk of escalation. And when it comes to military planning, escalation is very easy. De-escalation is really, really hard. You have really got to be thoughtful in bringing the temperature down. And as Admiral Fox said earlier, the Iranians are masters of keeping the tension just below the red line level, just below the boiling point. And I think the other thing is, again, a little bit out of our respective lanes, but what is the will of the American people? What is the mood of the public? There's one comment in the window of Q&A about, you know, this money that may be going to the Iranians. I think that there's a hostage aspect to that. But what is the will and the mood of the American people in the Middle East relative to additional tensions, additional conflict with the Iranians? And, you know, I think Admiral Fox and I were very fortunate that the American people for the past 20 plus years have been completely supportive of all that we were doing in the Middle East. That's remarkable. That was a remarkable political achievement in my mind, keeping the American people engaged in a troubling conflict for that long. I'm just not sure where the will and the mood is right now if something bad would happen to a handful of Marines on a commercial vessel at the hands of the Iranians.
Building on that, we have a question about if something were bad were to happen. The question is, if Marine deployment on board commercial ships were to lead an armed confrontation with Iranian armed forces, what deconfliction channels are you aware of that would prevent such an encounter from escalating into a wider conflict? How confident are you that those channels are sufficient to prevent escalation?
So we do interact with the Iranians every day at sea, all the time. And you have bridge-to-bridge communication. They don't necessarily, they're not professional and they're not necessarily responsive, but when I was there, I did not have any means of direct communications to try to, you know, some sort of a red switch or something that I could call and try to de-escalate a situation. We tried and it was not successful. I can't speak to today, and you know, you see what's going on with China, where we continue to try to have, you know, Secretary Austin be in touch with his counterpart. If somebody doesn't want to talk to you, then it makes it very difficult. And typically we will work through surrogates. You know, the Omanis are probably, they live there and they're kind of stuck with their geography, just like the Iranians. And so, you know, there were a number of cases where, for example, Iranian fishing boat exploded and burned up, and these guys were all in the water. We pick eight of them up. Well, how do you get them back? Well, one time we used a U.S. Coast Guard means to go Coast Guard to Coast Guard, because there's a law enforcement to law enforcement kind of means. Another time we used the Omanis in weight, or one of their fishermen drowned and we recovered his body. And so how do you do the right thing and return his remains to his family? We did that via the Coast Guard. So there are kind of low-level things like that, but they're not real time and they're not tactical. So that's another. I keep harping on it, but miscalculation, when you can't communicate effectively, you create such potential for miscalculation.
Admiral Fox, what kind of response do you feel Iran would take if the U.S. Either says they're going to deploy Marines aboard commercial ships or actually demonstrably does it?
It's a hypothetical. It'd be hard for me to nail it because I've never really understood the Persian mind. Let's put it this way: if they had an opportunity to take a swipe at us, I think they would probably do that. I mean, look at what they did with explosively formed penetrators in Iraq. We had forces on the ground, and that didn't deter them whatsoever from trying to just bloody us. And they've killed a lot of young American Marines and soldiers from those explosively formed penetrators. I spent a year in Baghdad, and it was just infuriating. And they play on the fact that nobody in the West really wants to get into a shooting match with Iran. It's not worth it. They don't, it's not. And so therefore they feel, and as Smoke alluded to it earlier, Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the Iranians are responsible for such malevolent activity in Lebanon, in Syria, and it's in Yemen. And so, it's interesting to see, for example, how Saudi and Iran brokered with a Chinese creating kind of the negotiating platform of, the Saudis don't want to be mad at the Iranians all the time. And yet the Iranians have attacked, Saudi oil fields and refining. And in fact, the Saudis were kind of upset with us for not doing more, as a matter of fact. So the Iranians they are what they are. It's kind of like Def Gates said, I've never, whoever that mythical moderate Iranian is, I've never met him. Don't know who it is.
General Beidler, I'm going to combine a few questions together here. What kind of support will U.S. Central Command need to provide Marines aboard commercial vessels? And on a similar note, assuming the U.S. does commit to deploying small teams of Marines on ships in the Gulf, how large is the overall support package the U.S. would be committing to provide to the mission in terms of other Marines and air and naval assets over the coming weeks and months? And is there any way to know when the mission would be accomplished, or once begun, is it likely to become more open-ended?
That's a lot of questions all at once. I'll try to get through them. I think the first thing that will need to be provided is those naval forces and naval capabilities, U.S. Navy, that I mentioned earlier. Sustainment, medical, supply, lift, all of those kinds of things. I don't know when this would go into place. I don't know how long it's envisioned. There are a lot of unknowns in terms of implementation of a plan like this. Right now, these forces are coming from a MU that is already trained up for this, in process of final training, and is being deployed to the region, as I understand it. I think it's the 26 MU from Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I don't know what the MU deployment schedule looks like to the CENTCOM AOR right now. I don't know whether this would be continuous, but you're talking about 100 or so Marines in this group that would need additional capabilities, whether they came from the rest of the amphibious ready group that's deployed, other Marine Corps or other joint forces. There are other aircraft in the region. There are other capabilities in the region. So it's not a long list of Marine requirements, but the support requirements are probably greater than you would initially think to do this over time. That is typically the case. I think I've answered the first two of those questions. What's the third again, Ari?
The third was about if we could know when the mission would be accomplished. But then how large is the overall support package was also part of the question.
That gets back to a point I made earlier. Proving that you've deterred is a bit challenging. And what constitutes an event of such significance that it must be deterred? There are things that go on in the region that we're not happy with every single day on the sea. So you're not going to prevent all that you would like to prevent the Iranians from doing, but I think it's the big things. Disruption of the flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz is what I believe this is intended to prevent.
Admiral Fox, anything to add on what I certainly realized was a long string of questions, and happy to repeat them.
No, I agree with the Smoke's assessment of that. From the outside, the first impression is, this is a good idea. We are actually saying something about, we're concerned about maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz. That's a good thing. And we're highlighting it. And so the fact that we're having this discussion, on the one hand, is kind of good. For the people that are going to have to execute it and iron out all of these really thorny details of rules of engagement, who authorizes the use of lethal force, and all of that, that's really hard. And that it's solvable if you're willing. I don't see us, the U.S., putting our Marines in a place where they can't defend themselves. And if the master of the ship doesn't want to shoot, I mean, one of the things that happened when we were dealing with the piracy issue was, people don't really like weapons on commercial ships. I mean, it's something that you're going to have to find people who are willing to do this. And it created a real problem, because when a ship pulls into port and you've got weapons, you've got a whole other set of protocols you got to figure out of how you're going to deal with that. So these U.S. Marines, probably different. I mean, they're active duty military, but the civilian security people, it created all of these headaches of shipping companies going, it's not worth my time and effort. We'll just try to go fast and avoid the pirates. And in some cases, there were some civilian security guards during the heyday of the Somali pirates, and there were some really tragic, some fishermen that got killed, which goes back to the fraught nature of miscalculation and that sort of thing. So I think it's something, in broad strokes, you go, oh man, this is good. I'm glad we're focusing and we're talking about it. And then you get into the eaches and then the details, and I think it's a really, really tough nut to crack.
Admiral Fox, we have a question in on UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Do you feel that the U.S. should ratify it, and would it help our position today?
In practical terms, I don't think so. And the whole decision for us to not ratify that has created heartache, in certain circles. But in the practical aspects of day-to-day operations, I can't say that would necessarily be any kind of a magic wand that would change things significantly.
My final question for both of you, as we wind down our time here, is what is the possibility or risk of China becoming more involved in the Gulf region? General Beidler, I'll start with you.
Again, this is, I'm not a diplomat here, but China is keenly interested on this region. As I said before, about 75% or so of the oil that transits through the region ends up in Asia. They have been labeled, I believe, a free rider on the security that we and others have provided to the transits in the region. I think it's a double-edged sword. It would be nice to have more partners and allies contribute to this effort, but by the same token, I'm not sure we want the Chinese in that region any more than they currently are. So we've got to be careful what we ask for in terms of support. I think initially, I think you could expect that they'll push back on it, but quietly they will appreciate the continued free flow of energy to Asia.
So
Admiral Fox.
they're already there. It's not, are they coming? They're there. 2011 or 12, I boarded, there was a Chinese ship that pulled into Bahrain. They invited me, I went aboard. The Chinese then 10, 12 years ago, were learning how to be an ocean-going Navy. And in fact, they participated in the counter-piracy. It was the counter-piracy effort. We hosted this thing called the Shared Awareness and Deconfliction Meeting, SHADE, in Bahrain. And it wasn't quite the Star Wars bar scene, but it was pretty close. To include the Chinese would come. This was an open source with the view of anybody who's against pirates is on the right side of this problem. But the Chinese are there. And there's no question in my mind, if you look at the trends of their construction and their pattern of operation, they're in Africa, they're in the Med. They've taken task forces up into the European waters. But the Chinese are there, and so it's another important thing for us not to leave, quite frankly. So,
General Beidler, any final remarks?
I'll just try to answer this last question in chat here. The Marine Corps and the Navy can work through any Iranian signal jamming. Make no mistake about that. I think my final comments would be, this is a mission that the Marines are more than capable of performing. They have trained to it. There's a lot left to be said on us. Rules of engagement are at the top of the list. And then we've got to be careful about escalation and the risk associated with taking this on. Those are my final comments. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Admiral Fox.
Thanks, Ari. I enjoyed the session. I think we've highlighted all of the key things here, and I appreciate you including me and Smoke here in your seminar.
Thank you to our audience, Admiral Fox and General Beidler, for joining us today. Once again, I'll encourage everyone to read JINSA's memo on this subject and engage with JINSA's other work by going to our website, jinsa.org. Please look out for our next webinar invite in your email inbox. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.
Thanks, Ari.